Hello, Gary, Indiana. I had a conversation yesterday at an event, Jonathan Peterson's event. Actually, he's a councilman in Munster, a good friend of mine, and I definitely support him. They've done a lot of great things out in Munster with his leadership. But I was at this event of his, and I was having a conversation with some guys, and they're really successful guys. I like them a lot, and I definitely look forward to working with them. So don't get me wrong. But one of the things that they said when I was speaking to them kind of stuck me a little bit, and I just can't agree with it. And one of the things that they had mentioned is that Gary, Indiana is a suburb of Chicago. And I just can't get with that. Ultimately, I believe that all of the other cities and towns in Northwest Indiana ultimately are the suburbs, or should be the suburbs, of Gary, Indiana. And I really want to get into this and dive deeper into it as far as where we get the mentality that Gary, Indiana is a suburb of Chicago, what the real definition of a suburb is, and the economic relationship between Gary and Chicago. So I think this is really important for our citizens to understand where we stand, and also where my campaign stands as far as my initiative to compete head to head with Chicago and take their businesses and bring it here, and why it's important to compete with Chicago. Gary is not a suburb of Chicago because it's in a different state and has its own government, but it's considered part of the Chicago metropolitan area economically and socially. That's why people sometimes say Gary is a Chicago suburb, even though it's really its own standalone city. So here's what's going on with that. Suburb in everyday language versus suburb in planning language is the first thing to look at. Let's start with the everyday meaning of suburb, which is a suburb is a smaller town that depends on a bigger city. Second is the planning and economic meaning. A suburb is a community in the same labor market region where many residents commute to the big city for work. Gary used to have tens of thousands of people commuting to the city for steel mill jobs, so it wasn't out to Chicago at the time. So historically, Gary was not a suburb, it was its own industrial powerhouse. But today, due to the fact that liberal leaders kept all of their eggs in one basket rather than expanding into other industries while the opportunities were plentiful because U.S. Steel was strong, many Gary residents work in Chicago or in Chicago suburbs. Chicago liberal media dominates here. Chicago's job market heavily influences our wages here, and Chicago's special interests determine what and how much business we are allowed to have here. So federal planners categorize Gary as part of the Chicago-Naperville-Elgin metropolitan statistical area. The point here is Gary was never designed to be a suburb. It was built as its own standalone city. Gary was built in 1906 by U.S. Steel to be a self-sufficient industrial city with its own downtown area, its own school corporation, its own city government, its own police, fire, and utilities, neighborhoods as well as its own identity and culture. Gary is a city and not a suburb, but economic migration patterns in the last 50 years pulled it into Chicago's economic orbit. The problem both politically and culturally is rather simple. When people say Gary is just a Chicago suburb now, what they're really saying is Gary has lost its economic independence. Gary's job market depends on Chicago, and Gary doesn't have its own economic engine anymore. Why this matters is because cities are not economically independent and therefore cannot build tax base, cannot grow population, and cannot control their own future. That's why my campaign is about rebuilding Gary's independence by going head to head with Chicago, who dominates our city's policies, our politicians, our media, and even our airport. And by doing so, we will bring back industry, businesses, jobs, and a tax base through the conservative values of competition and free enterprise so that Gary is a city again and not just a satellite. So let's get together, let's push our movement, and let's leave Chicago behind.